Hey guys, Vache here from Solo Guitars. Today we are talking about binding channel routes. At Solo, we have multiple tools to get the job done, and we'll take an in-depth look at each one of these so that you can make the most informed decision on which one will fit your needs the best. So we have certain tools that are designed to be used with a Dremel, and then we have certain tools that are designed to be used with your standard 1/4" shank router. All right, so let's get started on the Dremel attachments. Now, the Dremel actually comes with this cap that you can simply just remove like that. And we'll start with our precision base. Now, the precision base has that same threading over here. So you can just thread that right on. And now you have the base attached to your Dremel. Now, this in and of itself isn't for the binding channel. This is more for precision work that you would do on a fretboard, whether you're doing inlay work and whatnot, and you don't want to use a heavy duty router. You want to use the Dremel, but you want the stability of having a base. And that's what this is for. However, you can also purchase the router edge guide, which is an attachment for the base, and that is the part that is for the binding channel. So the router edge guide actually just attaches to the base like that. Take those 2 screws. And just attach it to the base like that. Simple as that. And now the edge guide is attached. Now on the edge guide itself, we have another set screw right over here that we can undo. And then this knurled knob will actually move this bearing back and forth depending on how far into the guitar you have to go. Now the bit will actually dictate how deep we go into the guitar vertically, and this bearing portion will determine how deep we go into the guitar on a horizontal plane. And so the easiest way of doing that would be to just take your binding, put it up against your bit, make sure that you leave just a tiny bit for scraping afterwards, and then keep your bit on the widest part, and then just bring this up or down based on what you need, and then tighten that set screw. So that's the precision base with the router edge guide. Now, very similarly, but also kind of different, is the binding router guide. And again, threaded part for the Dremel. And you just thread that right on. And the part that's different about this is with the precision router base, we were routing with our Dremel held vertically, whereas with the binding router guide, we are actually holding our Dremel horizontally, which means the job of the bit and the bearing are kind of reversed. So now your bit is going to dictate how far you go into the guitar horizontally, and the bearing part that you can adjust will dictate how far you're going to go down the guitar on the vertical plane. Again, very similar to the precision router base, you have the 1 set screw and the knurled knob. And so in this case, you're going to bring your bit up so that it's the same height as your bit. And then this to the edge of the bit will be the actual depth. And just like that, right horizontal, just like that on the guitar, and just run it down. And that'll give you that channel. So those are the Dremel attachments. Now, the simplest way to actually do the binding, in my opinion at least, is the Pesa R0402 bit. And that is a flush trim bit that comes with a bearing that's the same size as the actual cutting head. But in addition to that, it also comes with a bearing that's smaller than the cutter head, and is actually the difference between the two would be the thickness of your actual binding. And so it's kind of, don't even think about it, put the bearing on, you unscrew that Allen screw right there, put the bearing on, and you could just comfortably go right down your guitar, and that'll open up the channel the same thickness as your binding. Now let's say you have an arch top or a carved top guitar. Well, then none of these Dremel tools will actually help you out, because you can't put any of the bases on the arch top. You would just follow the contour of these curves, and you would end up with a very wonky line. And what you would need is the solo binding router jig. And I'll put this together in just a second to show you how it actually works. But this essentially keeps your router stationary vertically. And so what you would do is once you have your router on there, you can actually just move the guitar, and the router base itself does not touch the guitar. All right, so let's start with the Solo Pro Precision Router base with the edge guide. All right, and there we have it. Perfect. Just have to clean up that edge a bit. And once you do that, your binding will sit perfectly in there. All right, so this was the result we got with our Solo Pro Precision base along with the edge guide. And now we could move on to our solo binding router guide. And there you go. We have another route for binding. All right, so now let's move on from the Dremel to routers. Now, like I said at the beginning, the easiest way to get that binding channel would be the Peza R0402, which is a flush trim bit. And it also comes with a smaller bearing that you can actually swap out for the bearing that it comes with. And the difference between the actual cutter head and the bearing is the thickness of the binding. So I've gone ahead and already switched the bearing on one of them. And as you can see over here, you'll see where the cutter head is and where the bearing is. And that's the difference of the actual binding. So when that bearing goes up against your substrate, your guitar, it's going to actually cut the difference right there. So let's just get that onto our router. We can go ahead and adjust the height of our base based on our binding. And there you have it. You're flush on the side, you're flush on the top. Super, super, super fast results. All right, so let's say you have a carved top or an arch top guitar. Now, if you were to use just your router with that bit on it, it's actually gonna follow the contours of the top of the guitar and get you a very crooked and wonky line. And so for that, we have our solo router binding jig. And the way this works is it actually keeps the router stationary, does not move, and also the base of the router doesn't actually touch the guitar, which means you're moving the guitar without even it touching the router. And to actually assemble this, I have here a scrap piece of plywood, about 2 feet by 2 feet, just so that the guitar comfortably fits on it. And so let's take our halfway mark here on 24 inches. So on 12 inches, and then now this part you don't have to be dead center, but I just like to be. So take my square about there and just draw a line right there, just in the center of the actual piece. And then now this will be the base that holds the actual T-slot in place. So I'm just gonna mark center right there. And so what it comes with is these two inserts and these two screws that will actually, the inserts will go into the plywood and these screws will screw right into the inserts holding it, and these will go into the T-slot holding the base in place. All right, to get these inserts into the plywood, I have a 1-inch Forstner countersink it so that it's flush, and I have a 13/32 bit to get this part in there. Now you could use a drill press if you want to, but for the sake of staying at this table for the video, I'm just going to use a hand drill. All right, so we have our countersunk holes drilled out. We are going to take those inserts and just put them in there, and then take a hammer just get them. This is actually the bottom. So we're going to flip that over, and now we can take the base and attach it. Put those two screws in the threads, and this set actually comes with a bunch of Allen keys and wrenches. Give it a good tightening, and that'll pull up that insert even more into the lumber. Now that we have that, we can go ahead and slide the actual T-slot into there. But before we do that, we have another T-slot nut over here, and I'm gonna slide that in here, and you'll find out why. Just makes it easier to do it before I install it. And so we installed that T-nut in there and just gave it a bit of a tightening so it doesn't move. All right, now our base is stationary. All right, so now that we have our T-slot bar installed, we can go ahead and install our router on our base that is going to move up and down on this bar. Now there's a chance that the holes that are pre-drilled on the base will not match the holes on your router base. You have a couple of options there. You can either drill new holes on this base, or you can put in a new piece of plexiglass with the hole pattern if you want to save the stock plexiglass plate that came with your router. Or you could do what I did, and I just, because they weren't getting in the way, just put in new holes on the plexiglass plate that came with my router. So I'm just going to go ahead and install that onto the base. All right, so now that we have our router base attached to our router, you can see here that we have 3 V-shaped bearings, and we have a V-shaped bar on the actual T-slot tower. And those V-shaped bearings are going to slide right over that bar. And that bolt we put in earlier before mounting the actual T-slot is actually our stop. So anytime the router sits on it, that will be your depth stop. We can put one at the top as well to stop it from coming up to the point where it comes off the tower altogether. So these are all adjustable. you can adjust the height. And so in my case, I don't even think I'm gonna need that depth stop at the bottom, because I need to go so low that I might just end up using the table as my depth stop. Don't forget, you can still adjust your router bit on the actual router itself. This doesn't have to be the only way you adjust the height. Let's slide that back on and then check with our guitar body. And there you go. Now let's take our sacrificial piece before I explain how it's useful for an arch top or a carved top. And much like the time we used it without the tower, the bearing is going to be what stops the bit from going into the body further than we need it to. And it is just that simple. You can see the slot over there. We put in our binding. You can see how perfectly that lines up. This is the simplest method of doing it. Now, whether you use the actual T-slot routing jig or just a handheld router on its own, the same bit is applied. This just makes your job a lot easier because you don't have to hold the actual router. And actually it becomes the only way you could do it when you're doing a carved top or an arch top. Now, like I said before, if I were to just take this router and try to carve out the binding channel on this guitar body, well, that bass is going to be sitting on top of the guitar and it's just going to be wavy and a wonky and a crooked line. The beauty about this is the actual router is stationary and the base of the router has no contact with the actual guitar. And so if I were to just take this guitar and just run it around like so, I would get a perfectly straight binding channel every single time. Well, we can go ahead and just try it. Let's check our height. Height is good. And let's go ahead and route this carved top. So this guitar already had binding on it, which is why it looks all flaky. But there you could see perfectly routed binding channel on a carved top, which is really impossible to do with just the router sitting on top of the guitar body. Now, one thing you have to remember is, and I've made this mistake once before, but believe me, it was a one-time mistake that I'll never live down. Jack plate holes. When you're using this type of method, that bearing right there, if you're doing a deep cut, that bearing is very likely to end up falling into that jack hole. And so as it's going, there's nothing stopping the bearing because there's nothing for it to ride on around this area. So that bit is just going to go right through your guitar. Now in this case, which is why I was very careful when I was routing this area, is my bearing actually ended up just hugging that space in between the bottom of this channel and the top of that jack hole. And if you're not careful and you're doing a deeper cut, you're going to cut perfectly here and then just gouge a hole in here and move on. So whether you have to put a dowel in there or whatever you want to do, whatever your fix is for that, make sure that that bearing doesn't fall into that hole right there. So there you have it. We just used a bunch of different tools to route out a binding channel. Now all these tools are available on the Solo Guitar website, and the links for them will be posted down below. Please subscribe to our channel, as we are always increasing our library of video content at Solo Guitars.